Welcome to the JD Power Insurance Intelligence Podcast. I'm Michael Vermillion with JD Power, and with me today are Steve Crewdson. Steve, welcome. And Mark Garrett.
Hey.
Welcome, Mark. And Breanne Armstrong.
Hello.
Breanne, welcome. So before we jump into the topic for today, just wanted to touch on any recent news. So we did see an article over the weekend in the New York Times about certain apps on smartphones collecting information and potentially that information making its way back to the insurance companies. So Steve, Mark, Breanne, I don't know if you saw that article or not, but just wanted to get your thoughts on if that's really happening. What would the implications be for the carriers and for consumers?
Well, for today, we wanted to talk about the concept of consumer trust in their insurance company. And I think there's been a number of stories as of late around companies sharing driving data, location data of consumers when the consumer may not have been fully informed of what they were opting into, or at least they feel like they weren't fully informed of what they were opting into by not reading what could be dozens of pages of terms and conditions when downloading an app. So I think as these stories continue to come out, it's going to potentially lead to an effect on the trust that insurers have. I should back up with customers have with insurers. If insurers are accessing information that's being collected in a way that the customer didn't know that information was being collected or that it would be shared with an insurer to influence a premium, I think that could definitely have a harmful impact on the trust that the general consumer has with the industry.
I'd say I think Steve touched on it well. I mean, that's certainly, I think the more that this is getting picked up, this is the second article I think we've seen in just the last week, I want to say, week or two, that we've seen this commented on a couple times now. So I think it is that, the industry is in a tricky position there where, that transparency and making it clear to customers is certainly becoming front and center now. And I mean, I would fully anticipate, expect that would erode trust in the insurer if you're finding out that they're kind of, have these workarounds bearing this language that ultimately, you raise the rates. It's a sensitive issue now. It's getting lots of coverage about premiums increasing. Then you find out they're doing it by gathering data that you weren't even aware they were tracking. I absolutely see that being certainly a big trust issue.
Yeah, and I think too, it just shows how much trust can be impacted by more than just the direct experience, right? So, seeing this covered in the media, I'm sure will have an impact on individuals' trust with their insurance company, whether or not they were directly impacted by this. Hearing this, it's kind of this halo effect, right? So I think, it's one of those things where brands have to be thinking about trust from kind of a public persona perspective, right? In addition to the experience too. So I wouldn't be surprised if, we see a broader impact on how customers are viewing, their insurance company, whether or not they're directly impacted.
Okay, that's a good segue for today's topic, actually. We're publishing the 2024 auto insurance study this month. And one of the key focus areas for that study is the holistic nature of the relationship between the customer and the insurer, and a critical element of that relationship is trust. So before we kind of dive into this idea of trust, perhaps we should just level set on the definition, Breanne. So when we talk about trust, what do we mean by that? How are we defining it?
Trust, it's, a pretty broad concept, right? It can be a little nebulous trying to figure out exactly what trust is, but honestly, it really kind of boils down to the idea of following through on the brand promise, right? That's kind of the broad definition, I think, that at least for our perspective.
The North Star for JD Power across all of our studies is customer satisfaction. So how do we connect the dots between trust, this concept of trust, and customer satisfaction, and what does the correlation look like?
Trust is actually, at least looking at our auto insurance study, is the most highly correlated dimension of the experience with overall satisfaction. So it has a strong correlation. When we look at data, we see trust and overall satisfaction essentially kind of follow the same pattern, right? So if trust goes down, overall satisfaction goes down. having high trust can help with retention. It can help with advocacy. So it really has a strong correlation to overall satisfaction.
Steve, what about on the shopping side of things? Is there a connection between trust and acquisition, specifically things like close rates and even close rates on high CLV customers?
Yeah, I think we looked at the data this year in the shopping study that published back in April, and what we saw was trust has an impact on the overall acquisition funnel, but trust really plays in at the higher levels of the funnel more than close rate. What we saw was that trust as a concept will, if the consumer who's out shopping feels a higher level of trust towards a brand, they're more likely to consider that brand for their auto insurance and perhaps go and get a quote from that brand. The effect is less when we get to the close level of the funnel, but I would say that trust is still playing an indirect role there, in the sense that, as Breanne just said, overall satisfaction with service experience is impacted by trust and vice versa. We see that the importance of past service experiences from a brand, even if those are word of mouth. So I might have heard that this insurance company I'm getting a quote from has great service experiences. I've heard that from friends, family, colleagues, and others. That will have a notable impact on the close rate. That feeling that the brand will provide a good service experience, which, as Breanne just mentioned, is correlated highly with trust. And another analysis we did look at the overall level of trust of a brand and their book of business and what portion of their book of business is made up by high CLV customers. And we did see a relationship, a fairly strong relationship between the brands that are trusted more are also more likely to have a higher share of what we call high customer lifetime value customers as part of their book of business. So what that means is customers who are more likely to be retained, more likely to be less price sensitive, which really matters in today's market with increasing premiums, and also just more likely to have multiple policies with the insurer. So all in all, they definitely look like a customer that should be a better lifetime value for that insurer. And the insurers that have a higher level of trust win more of those customers.
Okay, great. So why don't we switch the conversation to be a bit more prescriptive and what steps carriers should be taking to improve or enhance trust with their customers. Breanne, why don't we start on the servicing side? What steps can the carriers take to improve trust?
There's essentially different kind of moments of truth, right? Where there could be a breakdown in the experience. So carriers can, during the servicing experience, look to those particular instances, right? So, something like problem resolution. So ensuring that you're following through on that, you have an organized approach to problem resolution, right? It essentially looks like you know what you're doing, right? As an insurance company. Taking responsibility if there's an issue is also, has a big impact as well. And in addition to that, looking at how customers interact, right? So ensuring that their needs can be met. They're able to contact the insurer through the right channel. We even see on the digital side, there can be an impact on trust as well, right? So, personally, I don't always associate a website, usage with trust. But what we've seen is that if individuals rate the website as being easier to navigate, they can find the information, it's more clear, then trust is higher. So it's, in addition to kind of following through on promises, it's also putting out, a persona that the insurance company is organized and has the information readily available for the customers and can make things easy, right? And reduce that anxiety piece, right? Reduce stress. Another thing too is around claims, and maybe I can pass it to Mark here in a moment, but we do see a lot around setting expectations, right? And then following through on those expectations and providing updates. And we really, around the claims experience in general, because that's typically like the moment of truth, right? And that's where trust gets impacted, pretty much the most we see across kind of the experience. So, Mark, this would probably be a good chance for you to kind of let us, know what you've seen on your side.
Sure. Yeah, right. I mean, a lot of what you mentioned there certainly apply to a lot of kind of best practices or things to be mindful of, going through a claim experience. Clearly, this is the moment they're using their insurance product, right? The ultimate, I think, moment of truth where you're actually using the product. So we certainly see trust. And what's interesting is claims is one of the biggest, or I think the biggest driver of satisfaction overall, the way I think about my carrier. And then the subcomponent of the biggest driver of how satisfied I am with the claim experience is we see trust playing a large role in that, right? It is the biggest driver of that overall satisfaction. It's just like the trust I have in the carrier. And we also see that very similar, we ask a very kind of similar concept where it's, do they have my best interest in mind or the company's best interest in mind? Right. And as you can see, the more you're designing things and those steps in the process around the customer to like everything Breanne just mentioned, make it easy for them, eliminate hassles, be transparent, right? Set expectations, but also, right, keep communicating with them, be available to them. When we look at, since we've added trust and we're in the middle of fielding now, so I don't have like the full year-end results, but if we just looked at kind of our midpoint data, stuff we've gathered now, we see a really strong link of trust to a lot of the communication steps, right? So avoiding problems with communicating, making it easy, to get a hold of people, be responsive, be consistent in your messaging. It's when those things get executed on, we see trust scores in the 800s on a 1,000-point scale versus the 3s and 400s if those aren't met. I mean, there's just a huge drop off in trust if you do create kind of these barriers or issues if the customers are uncertain what's happening. So clearly, it's a critical factor to get right, in a claims experience. Absolutely.
So let's just kind of wrap up then with how the carriers can get started around trust. So clearly, with the auto insurance study, JD Power can bring benchmark data. I think we can also map customer expectations around trust to help the carriers understand that perspective as well. Breanne, what else can a carrier do to really kind of understand specifically the pain points around trust from that customer perspective? What type of internal diagnostic or self-assessment could be conducted?
Yeah, great question, Mike. So I think, I had already kind of alluded to the moment of truth, right? The moments of truth in an experience. So, identifying where there's, a breakdown, right? So you can look at, we could look at JD Power data to get, a feel for where we see trust drop a lot. But internally, you can take a look at things like, how long does it take to settle a claim? How, are customers able to use the channels that they want to, right? So there's some additional kind of a analysis and kind of determination that an insurance company can make when they look at it. I think also too, what's important is understanding your customers too, because even though we've seen in the results that trust is impacted fairly equally kind of across different groups, there are some differences, right? So being able to segment your customers to understand kind of what is most impactful for trust too is important as well. So, newer customers, we found it's harder to build trust, right? Because they're not familiar with you. So understanding ways that you can kind of start building trust right away, which will then lead to, a stronger chance of loyalty and advocacy. So understanding kind of those newer customers and their needs, I think is also could be something that insurance companies look at.
All right, thanks, Breanne. So why don't we just go around the horn and get any last thoughts on trust, the topic of trust for today? Is there anything that we didn't cover? So Steve, why don't we start with you? We'll go to Mark and finish with Breanne.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I would say if we just step back a few big steps and realize that auto and homeowners insurance are products that consumers just don't generally understand all that well. It's one of the findings we've seen for more than 2 decades doing our work. And when you don't understand something well, it's easy to lose some trust in a brand, right? So Breanne and Mark touched a lot upon general servicing and claim servicing, doing what you say you would do, being transparent, making sure that the perception is that the brand is looking out for the customer as much or more so than the brand itself. Those are all things that insurers will need to keep in mind, especially in this day and age where we just discussed the news story at the beginning of this podcast where more and more data sources are becoming available to companies, including insurance companies, and how they use that data. Are they being transparent with their consumers and their customers, and our customers feeling that that data is being used fairly? Those are all things, and many other ways data is being shared and used today that can affect a consumer's perception of trust, especially in this space where consumers don't understand how prices are set all that well, what the coverages are all that well. They just don't understand the insurance mechanism all that well. So the trust can be a bit more fragile here than in other tangible products. So I'd ask insurers to keep that in mind of how fragile the trust can be, and make sure that they're doing what they can to maintain that trust with the customer.
Mark, any last thoughts?
Yeah, you know what? I think about kind of the levers of where we see the issues. I talked about the communication side, but also, as Steve alluded to, on the coverage side, that's another area where we certainly see a big disconnect. So if someone's not getting as much money as they expected, or they're getting a partial denial or hitting some coverage limits, I mean, the disconnects around the settlement clearly that's another area where we see huge impacts on trust. So I think that does boil down to, maybe even some of the expectations setting up front when they're purchasing the policy, getting the sales team all on board, or the agents, to really make sure they're having that comprehensive discussion with customers. They got to understand a little bit more about, how those policies are working. I think that's an opportunity to address that too. Because, just something different than a lot of the, expectation setting and the transparency and those things as well. Certainly communication and having, informed, customers along the way. But certainly it also helps with just the insurance literacy side to understand the product better too.
Thanks, Mark. Breanne, any last thoughts on trust?
Yeah, I think one thing that we didn't really talk about as much that I think is critical is, obviously with prices going up, a lot of people are dissatisfied, right? Their insurance costs are going up. It's a lot of times unexpected. It's maybe not communicated the best. And what we see is, it's kind of a chicken or the egg situation, but we see individuals who have higher trust tend to be less impacted by premium increases, meaning that it has less of an impact on their overall satisfaction. It can essentially kind of create a buffer, right? If there's higher trust, then the customer can kind of understand, oh, my insurance company is doing this because I have to, right? On the flip side of that, we also see trust higher when insurance companies get ahead of those premium increases. They, communicate that it's coming, help the insureds understand why the premium is increasing. And so we see trust higher among those individuals too, who had a premium increase, right? If they expect it and they know why. So it's kind of, again, it's a chicken or the egg thing, but regardless, the important thing is that trust is important, and individuals are happier if they know what to expect, and then and have higher trust, right? So kind of, all works together and to create a better customer experience. So I think, the more carriers can kind of focus in on the trust component and building that right away, the less price sensitive their customers will be, and kind of the better able they'll be to navigate the, this hard market, right, situation.
So Steve, Mark, and Breanne, thanks for joining us today. And we want to thank our listeners as well. And we'll see you next time.